the first assassin made one mistake. He breathed. Not loudly. The Kreth were professionals, and professionals controlled their breathing in the way that all their training demanded, slow and measured and silent. The kind of breath that left no trace in the recycled air of a diplomatic vessel, moving through deep space at 300 hours when every being aboard was asleep, and the corridors were dark, and the only sound was the low hum of the engines doing their patient, mechanical work. But Marcus Cole had been listening to the dark for 38 years, and 38 years of listening to the dark had produced in him a calibration that went beyond training, beyond the formal instruction of 3 wars and 200 combat engagements, and the accumulated professional knowledge of a career built in the specific, brutal school of situations where inattention was measured in deaths. It had produced something older than training. Something that Earth had been producing in its inhabitants for as long as Earth had been the kind of place that required it to be produced, which was a very long time. He heard the breath. He was standing in the maintenance corridor junction at the intersection of corridors 7 and 9, in the dark, in the specific way that he stood when he was working, not leaning, not tense, perfectly balanced, occupying exactly as much space as necessary and no more, visible to nothing that was not looking for him and invisible to most things that were. He had been standing there for 2 hours. He had been standing in this specific spot for 2 hours because 4 hours ago, when the Velen diplomatic vessel had departed from Nexus Station, and Marcus had begun his standard sweep of the ship's layout, he had identified Corridor 7's maintenance junction as the point of entry he would use if he were a Kreth assassin attempting to breach a diplomatic vessel of this class. He was not a Kreth assassin. He had, however, spent 38 years developing the specific habit of thinking like whoever was going to try to kill the person he was protecting, because that habit was the difference between protecting someone and failing to protect someone, and Marcus Cole had never failed to protect someone. The breath came from the left branch of Corridor 7, approximately 8 meters. One being, moving with the professional stillness of someone who had done this many times and was very good at it. Behind them, he heard the absence of sound that indicated 2 more presences, following at the interval that 3-person breach teams used when the lead element was on approach, close enough for coordination, far enough that a single disruption didn't take all 3. 3 of them. He had expected 3. The Kreth Guild standard breach protocol for a target of the Senator's security classification was 3 elements on entry, with a 4th holding at the extraction point. He had found the 4th 2 hours ago, positioned at the docking bay junction in a shadow that would have been invisible to any sensor the ship carried, and to any being who had not spent 4 hours mapping every shadow on this vessel and determining which ones a professional would choose. He had left the 4th alone. The 4th was information, the location of the exit point, the confirmation that this was guild work rather than independent, the data point that told him the breach team would follow standard protocol, which meant their route and their timing and their target were all predictable. Predictable was good. Predictable was what you built plans around. The lead element came around the corner. Marcus was not where the lead element expected a problem to be, which was anywhere in their sight line. He was behind them in the specific way that required moving without sound in the 3 seconds between the lead element passing his position and the second element entering the corridor, a movement he had executed in training approximately 400 times and in the field more times than he had counted, and which he did now with the economy of motion of someone for whom the movement was not a skill but a reflex. The first assassin died before he knew Marcus was there. Not loudly. Marcus had been killing people quietly since he was 22 years old, which was when the first of the 3 wars had started, and quiet was a professional standard he maintained with the same attention he maintained all professional standards. Comprehensively, without exception, because exceptions got people killed. The first assassin went down in the specific, complete way of someone whose nervous system had been interrupted at the source, and Marcus was already moving before the body reached the floor, which it did silently because Marcus had his hand on the shoulder to manage the descent. The second assassin heard something, not the death of the first, which had been silent, but the absence of the first's footsteps, which was the sound that a trained professional heard when their lead element stopped moving without signal. The second turned, had exactly 1 second to register what was turning toward him in the dark. The 1 second ended. The third ran. This was the correct decision, the correct tactical decision, the decision that training and instinct and the survival arithmetic of a professional who has just lost 2 teammates in under 4 seconds all produced simultaneously. Run. Report. Regroup. The decision was correct, and the execution was immediate and professional, and it failed completely, because Marcus had already been to the end of Corridor 7, and had already identified the only route the third assassin could take that led to the extraction point, and had already determined that the junction at Corridor 11 was where someone running that route would be when someone who had left first arrived there moving at the speed Marcus moved when he was not trying to be quiet. The third assassin found Marcus waiting at Corridor 11. The third assassin's last professional assessment, formed in the 2 seconds available before the assessment became irrelevant, was that this was not possible. The math of distance and time said it was not possible. The math was correct, and the conclusion it produced was wrong, because the math did not account for the specific variable of a human being from Earth who had been running toward things that were trying to kill him since the age of 19. Ambassador Dren heard none of this. He heard something, a sound below the threshold of what he would have called a sound, a disturbance in the specific quality of the silence that the ship maintained at 300, the kind of disturbance that woke you without knowing why. He had been sleeping lightly for the past 6 hours because he was a diplomat traveling with a child who was a threat target, and light sleeping was the habit of someone who had been in difficult situations and had survived them. He opened his door. The corridor was as it should be, dim, empty, quiet, except that it was not entirely empty. At the junction of corridors 7 and 9, in the faint emergency lighting that the ship maintained through the sleep cycle, Ambassador Dren saw 3 shapes on the floor and 1 shape standing, and the standing shape was Marcus Cole, who was checking something on the nearest fallen shape with the methodical attention of someone completing a task that required confirmation. Dren was 63 years old. He had been a diplomat for 40 of those years and had navigated situations that his colleagues described as difficult and that he described as requiring patience. He had been in 4 situations that qualified as dangerous by any reasonable standard. He had never stood in a corridor at 300 and looked at 3 dead beings and 1 living one, who appeared to have produced the 3 dead ones without assistance and without, as far as Dren could see, any indication that the process had cost him anything. Marcus looked up, saw Dren. His expression did not change, which was to say it remained what it had been since the moment Dren had first seen him 3 days ago at the Bodyguard selection, calm, attentive, carrying the specific quality of complete presence that Dren had initially read as blankness and had since begun to revise his assessment of. 3-person breach team, Marcus said. Guild markings on their equipment, Kreth Assassin Guild, standard classification. They came in through the maintenance corridor junction at 7. There's a 4th at the docking bay. I'll deal with him in a moment. Dren looked at the 3 shapes on the floor. He looked at Marcus. He said, because it was the question that the situation produced in him before any other question could form. What are you? Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to checking the nearest fallen shape, confirming what he was confirming, doing his job with the complete, unruffled attention of someone for whom this was a Tuesday. A bodyguard, Marcus said. Dren stood in his doorway at 300 and looked at 3 dead Kreth assassins, and a human being who had apparently produced this result without any evidence of difficulty, and thought that bodyguard was possibly the most insufficient word he had ever heard applied to anything. Lyra was awake. This did not surprise Marcus. He had known she was awake before he opened the door to her quarters. The specific quality of the silence inside was different from the silence of a sleeping room, and he had been reading the difference for long enough that he didn't need to think about it. He opened the door and she was sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest and her enormous dark eyes already on the door, watching it the way she watched things, with the complete, calm attention that had been the first thing he noticed about her at the selection. She was 11 years old and she was the most observant client he had ever had. That was not sentiment. That was a professional assessment. "You stopped them," she said, not a question. "Yes." She nodded. Once small, the nod of someone receiving information they had expected. She looked at him in the dim light of her quarters, at his hands, which she was apparently checking for injury, at his face, which told her something he couldn't control it from telling because she was very good at reading faces. "Are you okay?" she asked. He stopped. It was a simple question. 4 words. He had been asked thousands of questions in 38 years, in 3 wars, in 200 combat engagements, in every professional context that the career of a soldier and then a bodyguard produced, and the 4 words "Are you okay?" had appeared in those questions before, many times, and had never produced what they produced now, which was the specific internal stillness of being asked something real. Not asked about his status, not asked about his operational condition, asked if he was okay. By an 11-year-old alien child with enormous dark eyes who had picked him out of a lineup of bodyguards, because she said he looked like someone who was looking for danger rather than someone who was looking to be seen, which was the most accurate professional assessment anyone had made of him in 2 years. He thought about Maya. He didn't think about Maya often, not because he had forgotten or because the grief had diminished, but because he had learned, in the 2 years since the transport, that thinking about Maya while he was working was the kind of thing that cost you the fraction of a second that cost other people their lives, and he was not going to let that happen. He had put Maya in the same place he put everything that mattered while he was working, behind the work, separate from it, preserved and complete and not accessible during operational hours. But Lyra was 11 years old, and she had asked if he was okay, and the question, coming from her from this age in this room, reached past the operational hours designation and found the place where Maya was. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at him with those eyes. "You don't have to lie to me," she said. "I picked you because you looked like someone who was sad but still doing their job. I understand that." She paused in the way she paused, brief, considered, the pause of someone choosing words carefully at an age when most beings her age chose words without much care. "My mother died when I was 6. I know what still doing your job looks like when someone is sad." Marcus looked at her. At 11 years old, sitting up in bed in the dark on a ship that had just had 3 assassins breach its hull, calm, watching him with the eyes of someone much older than 11, asking if he was okay. He sat down. The chair by the door, the chair he had positioned specifically so that he could see both the door and the window from it, which was the correct tactical position, and which was also, right now, simply a chair next to a child who had asked him something real. He sat in it. First time he had sat down on a job in 2 years. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They sat in the dark in the specific, sufficient silence of 2 beings who had both lost something and understood that the silence was not empty, that it was, in fact, the most honest thing available. After a while she said, "What was her name?" He looked at her. "Maya," he said. She nodded. "How old?" 11, he said. Lyra looked at him for a long moment with those eyes. Then she looked at the door he was now guarding from the inside, and she said, with the simplicity of someone stating a fact they considered important, "I'm glad you're here." He looked at the door too, at the corridor beyond it where he had come from, at the job that was the job, and also now, something else that he was not going to examine while he was working, but that he understood with the complete, quiet certainty of someone who had been carrying a weight for 2 years and had just found, for reasons he could not have predicted, that the weight had a shape that fit here. "So am I," he said. They sat in the dark until the ship's lighting shifted to morning cycle, and Marcus did not sleep, and Lyra eventually did, and he watched the door and the window and listened to the ship and thought about his job, which was this child, which had always been this child, which had been this child from the moment she walked up to him in the selection lineup and said the most accurate thing anyone had said about him in 2 years. In the morning, Ambassador Dren called a threat assessment. He had not slept after the corridor. He had gone back to his quarters and sat at his desk and looked at his hands and thought about 3 dead Kreth assassins and a human bodyguard who had produced them without making enough noise to wake a diplomat in the adjacent corridor. And at 600, he had called his senior security advisor, a former military intelligence specialist named Kale, and told him to review everything. Kale reviewed everything. He reviewed the bodies first, the physical examination that a specialist performed when they needed to understand not just what had happened but how, because how told you more than what about the nature of the thing you were dealing with. He reviewed the maintenance corridor. He reviewed the sensor logs that showed nothing, which was itself information. The breach team had been good enough to get through without triggering sensors, which put them in a specific professional tier. He reviewed the timing. Then he reviewed Marcus Cole's file. He read it once, then he sat down and read it again. "Ambassador," he said, when Dren arrived at the assessment briefing, "I want to share some observations." Dren sat, "Please." "The 3 individuals in Corridor 7 were Kreth Guild assassins," Kale said. "Senior classification. I identified 2 of them from the Guild's known operative database. These are not low-level contractors. The Guild assigns senior classification operatives to targets of significant political value." He paused. "They were killed by someone who understood exactly how they moved, exactly where they would be, and exactly what to do about it, in approximately 12 seconds total across 3 separate engagements. The technique," he paused again, with the specific pause of a professional encountering something outside their normal reference range. "The technique is not in any standard bodyguard manual. It's not in any civilian security training database. What I'm looking at is special operations methodology. The highest tier." Dren looked at him. "Marcus Cole is listed as a private security contractor." "Yes," Kale said. "Before that, he was an Earth military special operations specialist. 3 conflicts. His service record is partially classified. The Earth military classifies certain operational details, and I don't have full access. But what I have access to gives me the following picture." He activated a display. "Earth. You are aware that Earth is classified as a Deathworld by the Cooperative's Planetary Assessment Division." "Technically," Dren said, "the classification is academic. Humans have adapted." "The classification is not academic," Kale said, and his voice had the quality of someone correcting a misunderstanding that had consequential implications. "A Deathworld classification means that the environmental conditions, atmospheric, geological, biological, are hostile enough to kill most sapient species within a survival window of hours to days without technological assistance. Earth has predators that have driven evolutionary pressure on humanity for millions of years. It has pathogens, it has weather events, it has geological activity, and for most of its history, its primary threat to human survival was other humans." He paused. "The result is a species that has been in continuous conflict with its environment for its entire existence. They do not learn to fight because fighting is useful. They learn to fight because not fighting means dying, for millions of years. That is the pressure that produces the human body, the pain tolerance, the recovery capacity, the stress response that other species' medical literature describes as physiologically extraordinary." He looked at the display. Marcus Cole specifically. "He fought in 3 planetary conflicts on Earth before humans reached the stars. Earth conflicts, ambassador, not space engagements, not clean military operations. Ground conflicts on a Deathworld. He then transitioned to Special Operations, which is Earth's designation for its most elite military personnel. 200 confirmed combat engagements. That number is in his accessible record. The actual number based on the classified sections is higher. He paused one final time. The 4 individuals who breached this vessel last night, 3 guild assassins and 1 extraction specialist at the docking bay, were, by the Cooperative's military standards, a significant professional threat. By Marcus Cole's standards, based on what his record describes him as having survived, they were a Tuesday. Dren was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the display, at the service record, at the planetary classification of Earth, Deathworld, a word he had always applied as a technical designation and was now hearing as a descriptor with actual content. He thought about the selection, about the lineup of bodyguards, the large ones, the well-equipped ones, the ones with visible weapons and impressive credentials, and the kind of presence that said protection in the way that most species understood protection. He thought about the small, quiet human in the corner who stood without moving and watched without looking like he was watching, and about Lyra walking past every other option and stopping in front of him. He thought about what she had said. He watches everything. The others are looking to be seen. He is looking for danger. 11 years old. The guild will send more, Kale said. This is a contracted kill. They don't abandon contracts. The next attempt will be larger. The first breach failing to a single human bodyguard will be considered an intelligence failure, not a capability failure. They'll send more people, possibly the guildmaster himself. Tax, Dren said. Yes. Dren looked at the display for a moment longer. Then he looked at the door, where Marcus was standing. He had not been in the room for the briefing, which was not standard, but Marcus had listened to the briefing through the door, which Dren understood now with the complete, slightly unsettling clarity of someone who had revised their assessment of what was standing in their corridor. What should I do? Dren said. Nothing, Kale said. He said it with the specific certainty of someone who had reached a conclusion and was confident in it. Whatever you were going to do, whatever security protocols you were going to add, whatever additional personnel you were going to request, nothing. Because if Warlord Tax is coming, the additional personnel will complicate Marcus Cole's operational picture, and complicating Marcus Cole's operational picture is the worst thing we can do right now. Dren looked at him. You're suggesting I leave the defense of this vessel and a child to one human bodyguard. I'm suggesting, Kale said carefully, that you leave the defense of this vessel and a child to the most qualified individual I have encountered in 20 years of security assessment, who happens to be a human. He paused. And I'm suggesting that you stay out of his way. Dren looked at the door for a long time. Then he stood and walked to it and opened it. Marcus was in the corridor where he had been during the entire briefing, standing in the position he always stood in, balanced, still, occupying exactly the space required. You heard, Dren said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Marcus said. Tax will come himself. I know, Marcus said. He usually does when a contract goes wrong. It's a professional pride thing. He paused. I was counting on it. Dren looked at him, at the calm, at the eyes that were watching the corridor in both directions simultaneously, or appeared to be, which was a thing that human eyes should not have been able to do, and that Marcus's eyes managed anyway through some combination of peripheral awareness and the specific attentiveness of someone who had been watching corridors for a very long time. Were you counting on it, Dren said slowly, when you took this job? Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I should check on Lyra. He walked down the corridor. Dren watched him go and thought about a Deathworld and a Tuesday and a question he had just asked that had not been answered, and thought that the non-answer was itself an answer, and that the answer was something he was going to need more time to fully understand. Warlord Tax arrived at the Velen diplomatic station 6 days later. He came with 12 assassins, not the standard 3, not the enhanced 6 that a failed contract usually warranted, but 12, which was the number the guild used when they wanted to make a point, when they wanted the completion of a contract to be understood as not just a completion but a demonstration. 12 was the guild saying, "This is what we do to targets that think they have protection." He also came with intelligence. The guild's intelligence division had reviewed the corridor incident, 3 dead senior operatives, no evidence of a struggle, no sensor indication of anything, recovered in approximately 12 seconds, and had produced a report that Tax had read 3 times. The report concluded that the breach team had been compromised by a human bodyguard operating at a level that did not match any human military profile in the guild's database. The report recommended elevated caution. The report used the word unprecedented twice, which was a word the guild's intelligence division used approximately once per decade. Tax had read the report. He had taken the elevated caution recommendation seriously, which was why he had brought 12 instead of 6. He had also taken the unprecedented assessment seriously, which was why he was here himself instead of sending another team. He had not taken it seriously enough. This was not immediately apparent to him when he arrived. The station was a standard Velan diplomatic installation. Medium size, functional, the kind of facility that prioritized meeting spaces and secure communication over defensive capability, because diplomatic facilities were not supposed to need defensive capability. His advance scout, sent ahead 3 days prior, had reported the senator's location as the 3rd-floor residential suite, confirmed through multiple corroborating observations. His advance scout had been allowed to make those observations. He had been watched making them, by eyes that did not appear to be watching, and the information he had gathered had been the information that those eyes decided he should gather. Tax did not know this yet. He knew it at the moment his 12 assassins breached the 3rd-floor residential suite and found it empty. Not recently vacated, not the impression of a fast evacuation, the scattered materials of hasty departure. Empty in the specific, deliberate way of a room that had been prepared to be empty, with the senator's personal effects arranged as they would have been if the senator were there. The environmental systems running at the profile of an occupied room, the kind of empty that was designed to read as occupied to everyone except someone who checked it in person. He knew it at that moment and he processed it in the 2 seconds available, and the processing produced the specific cold clarity of a professional understanding that they had been led somewhere rather than arriving somewhere, and he opened the tactical channel to his team and said, "Regroup." The lights went out. Not the emergency lighting that stayed on, the low red of a station in security alert, casting everything in the color of something urgent. The operational lighting went out, the bright functional illumination of a corridor, and in the red-tinted darkness that replaced it, Tax's 12 assassins became 12 professionals operating in a low-light environment, which was a thing they were trained for and equipped for, and which they executed correctly. Correctly was not enough. Marcus had been in this station for 6 days. He had spent the first 4 hours of the first day doing the thing he did when he arrived anywhere, mapping it, not looking at the official schematics, which he had also reviewed, but walking it, corridor by corridor, room by room, junction by junction, in the specific way that he walked spaces that might become operational environments, which was every space he was in, which was every space that contained someone he was protecting. He had identified 43 positions that a trained individual would use for concealment or attack. He had identified 11 positions that a trained individual would not use, but that worked better. He had identified the lighting system's control nodes. He had identified the emergency ventilation patterns that changed when the lighting shifted to security alert, which changed the air movement, which changed the sounds. He had moved Lyra twice in the past 2 days. She was in the maintenance section's secondary storage room, which was off every schematic the station had on its official system, because it had been added during a renovation 3 years ago and the system had not been updated. She was with Dren, who had been told to stay there and who, to his credit, had asked no questions and done exactly that. He had let the advanced scout observe. He had fed the scout the observation the scout was looking for, the senator's sweet, occupied, routine activity, no change from standard protocols. He had identified the scout on the first day, confirmed on the second, and spent the third and fourth days ensuring that what the scout observed was what Marcus chose for the scout to observe. He knew Tax was bringing 12. The scout's communication pattern, the frequency and content of his reports, assessed through the station's communication logs that Marcus had quietly obtained access to on day 2, indicated 12 as the most probable number. He had planned for 12. He had also planned for Tax personally. This was not the plan that Dren knew about. This was the plan inside the plan. The reason Marcus had taken this specific contract, with this specific client, at this specific location, when the Guild's intelligence profile of the Senator's threat landscape had indicated that Tax would personally oversee any failed contract in this sector. It was the reason he had accepted the lowest rate of any bodyguard in the selection lineup. It was the reason he had stood in the corner of the selection room, watching everything, while the other candidates competed for visibility. The corridor outside the residential suite went dark. 12 Kreth assassins in low-light mode, moving with the professional precision of Guild operatives who had never faced a situation they had not been able to handle, moving toward a tactical regrouping point that their training said was the correct response to a compromised breach position. Marcus was at the regrouping point, had been there for 4 minutes in the dark, in the specific position that made him not a presence in the room but an element of the room's geometry, something that the low-light optics would read as architecture rather than threat until the reading was irrelevant. What followed was 4 minutes. Dren watched it on the security feed from the maintenance section's secondary storage room. He watched with the complete, silent attention of someone observing something that their frameworks were not equipped to categorize. He had his hand over his mouth, not from nausea, from the specific physical response of a being witnessing something that their body understood was significant before their mind had finished processing it. Lyra watched it too. She had asked to see, and Dren had tried to object, and she had looked at him with those eyes and he had not objected further. She watched with a stillness that was remarkable in an 11-year-old, and that Dren understood after a moment was not the stillness of someone who was not feeling things, but the stillness of someone who was feeling things, and had decided that stillness was the appropriate expression. 4 minutes. 12 Kreth Guild assassins, senior classification, the Guild's operational elite, professionals who had between them more than 200 completed contracts. One human from a Deathworld who had been in this station for 6 days and had spent those 6 days making sure that, when this moment came, the outcome was not in doubt. At the end of 4 minutes, 11 of the 12 assassins were no longer a concern. The 12th was Tax. Tax ran. He ran because he was a professional and professionals ran when the calculation said running was correct. And the calculation said running was correct, because 11 of his 12 assassins had been removed in 4 minutes by something that moved through the station's darkness with the complete, unhurried efficiency of something that belonged to the dark, that was native to the dark, that had been functioning in the dark for 38 years and had gotten very good at it. He ran toward the docking bay. His ship was there, the same extraction protocol that every guild operation used, because protocols were what kept professionals alive through the inevitable variations of operational reality. He moved fast, using the station's maintenance corridors, cutting through the routes his advanced scout had mapped, moving with everything he had. He reached the docking bay. His ship was there. He crossed the bay in 20 seconds, reached the hatch, entered the access code, stepped inside and turned to seal the hatch. Marcus was sitting in the pilot seat. Tax had his weapon out in the time it took a professional to draw a weapon, which was very fast. He had it aimed in the time it took to aim, which was also very fast. He was a guildmaster, the head of an assassin organization that had completed contracts on protected targets for 30 years, and he was fast. Marcus was not holding a weapon. He was sitting in the pilot's seat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on Tax, and Tax's weapon was aimed at him. And Marcus looked at the weapon, and then at Tax with the expression of someone who had expected this specific moment, and found it exactly where he had expected it to be. "Hatch is sealed," Marcus said. "You sealed it yourself when you came in. Station security code, I changed the override 2 hours ago. Your ship's communication system is offline. I pulled the power coupling when I boarded." He paused. "Your weapon is the only variable, and I need you to know that if you fire it, you'll have completed your mission and failed the purpose of your mission, and I'd prefer you understand the distinction before you decide." Tax looked at him, at the calm, at the human sitting in the pilot's seat of his ship with no visible weapon and no visible concern, bleeding from what appeared to be 2 wounds that he had apparently decided were not operationally significant. "What do you want?" Tax said. Marcus looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer, long enough for Tax to understand that the question had been heard and was being given something more specific than a quick response, because quick responses were what you gave when the answer was simple, and this answer was not simple. "Civilian transport Velen 7, Marcus said, 2 years ago." Tax was still. 340 passengers, Marcus said. "Civilian designation, medical personnel, research staff, families, no military assets, no political significance." He paused. "You ordered that raid." The transport. Tax ran contracts, dozens per year, across multiple sectors, the operational volume of an organization that had been running for 30 years. He did not retain the details of every contract, but Velen 7 was not a contract he had forgotten, because Velen 7 had been flagged in the Guild's after-action review as an operation that had exceeded necessary parameters. The target had been a single individual, a cooperative intelligence asset traveling under civilian cover. The method Tax had authorized had been comprehensive, because comprehensive methods left no witnesses and no complications. 340 passengers, comprehensive. "You planned this," Tax said. Not a question. The architecture of it was assembling itself in real time. The selection, the lowest rate, the position in the corner, the perfect protection that had been perfect because it was also preparation. The advanced scout allowed to report. The 12 assassins handled in 4 minutes. The ship boarded before Tax arrived at the docking bay because Tax's route had been predictable, because everything had been predictable, because it had been made predictable. "I knew you'd come personally," Marcus said. "Failed contracts in this sector. It's in your operational pattern. I've been studying your operational pattern for 2 years." 2 years. Since Velen 7. Tax looked at the human in his pilot's seat and understood, with the complete professional assessment of a guildmaster who had spent 30 years reading operations, that this had been the operation, not the senator's protection, not the guild's contract. This. 2 years of preparation for this room, this conversation, this moment. "You did all of this," Tax said, "to get to me." "I did all of this," Marcus said, "because Lyra needed protecting. Both things can be true." Tax looked at him. "The girl." "She's 11 years old," Marcus said. "She picked me out of a lineup because she said I looked like someone who was sad but still doing their job. She asked me if I was okay after I stopped your breach team." He paused. "She's the best client I've ever had." Another pause, smaller. "Maya was 11 years old too. She was on Velen 7 with her school group, a research trip. She wanted to study xenobotany." He looked at Tax with the eyes of someone who had been carrying something for 2 years and had arrived at the place where they were going to put it down. "Her name was Maya Cole. She was 11 years old and she wanted to study alien plants. You killed her because you authorized a comprehensive method on a transport with 340 people on it because it was operationally convenient." Tax said nothing. There was nothing to say. The operational arithmetic of 30 years of contracts had never required him to know the names of the people who were not the target. They were parameters. They were the population of the vessel or the facility or the location. They were not names. Maya Cole, 11 years old, xenobotany. He looked at Marcus, at the specific thing in Marcus's face that had been there from the beginning and that he now understood was not calm. It was something that had been past grief and past anger for long enough that it had settled into something quieter and more final. The specific quality of a person who had arrived somewhere after a very long journey. "You brought your weapon," Marcus said. "It's your choice. I want you to know that I have thought about this moment for 2 years, and I have decided that if you put it down, I will take you to cooperative custody and you will face a war crimes tribunal for Velen 7 and for 14 other operations that killed civilians who were not your targets. I have the documentation. I've been building it for 2 years." He paused. "Or you don't put it down. That's also your choice. I want to be honest with you about what happens if you don't put it down." Tax looked at the weapon, at Marcus, at the hatch behind him that was sealed with a code he didn't have, at the communication system that was offline, at 30 years of contracts and 14 protected targets and an organization that had never failed to complete what it started. He thought about comprehensive methods and operational convenience and 340 passengers, and a name he had not known and would not have known and now knew. He did not put the weapon down. The docking bay was very quiet for a moment. Then Marcus stood up. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not something Tax survived long enough to fully understand, but it was something that Marcus had known would happen from the moment he sat down in the pilot's seat, because he had studied Tax's operational profile for 2 years, and the profile said that Tax did not surrender, and Marcus had planned for that too. When it was over, Marcus sat in the pilot's seat for a moment. He put his hands on his knees and he looked at the hatch and he thought about Velen 7 and about Maya and about the 2 years between that day and this one and about what he had built in those 2 years and what it had cost and whether the cost was worth what it had purchased. He thought about Lyra asking if he was okay. He thought about the dark of her room, the two of them sitting in the silence that was not empty, her saying, "My mother died when I was 6. I know what still doing your job looks like when someone is sad." He thought about Maya, who had been 11 and had wanted to study xenobotany, and about Lyra, who was 11 and who had looked at a lineup of bodyguards and picked the sad one because she understood what sad but still doing your job looked like. He sat for a long moment. Then he stood up and unsealed the hatch and went back. Lyra was in the corridor outside the maintenance section when he came back. She had not stayed in the storage room. Dren was behind her with the expression of someone who had tried to keep a child somewhere and had failed, which was an expression Marcus recognized as appropriate given the child in question. She looked at him, at the blood, 2 wounds, both manageable, both things he would deal with shortly, at the calm, at the thing behind his eyes that was the same thing that had been there since the selection and that was now slightly different. Not gone. Different. Shifted in some specific way that he could not have described precisely and that she apparently could because she was looking at it with those eyes and reading it the way she read everything, completely and accurately. She walked up to him. She was small. Velen children were small, smaller than human children the same age, the specific small of a species that was built differently. And she tilted her head back to look at his face, and she reached up and took his hand. She held it, both of her hands around his, around one of his hands, which was very large by her scale, and she held it and she said nothing. Marcus looked down at her. At this 11-year-old alien child with enormous dark eyes holding his hand in a corridor of a diplomatic station, and at the monitors above them where Dren's security feed was still running, and where Dren himself was watching, and at the specific, complete, quietly enormous thing that was happening in his chest, which was not grief, exactly, and was not the end of grief, exactly, but was something adjacent to both that he did not have a precise word for, and that he was not sure precision applied to. He didn't cry. He had not cried since Velen 7, not because the grief didn't warrant it, but because he had not had a moment where crying was the thing that was available and everything else wasn't. He had been working for 2 years. The working had been necessary and real and had produced this outcome, which was Tax and Velen 7 and the documentation and Lyra safe in a corridor holding his hand. He didn't cry, but if there was a moment in the past 2 years where crying had been close to possible, it was this one. "Okay," Lyra said softly, not a question, a statement, the specific statement of someone who had been watching and had assessed and had arrived at a conclusion. "Okay," she said again, quieter, and she held his hand and he let her. Ambassador Dren watched from the monitor. He watched for a long time without speaking. His aide, standing beside him, said nothing either, because there was nothing to say that the monitor wasn't already saying. Then Dren said, quietly, to himself as much as to anyone, "I hired a human bodyguard because he was the cheapest option." His aide said, "And?" Dren looked at the monitor, at Marcus and Lyra in the corridor, at the 38 years of Earth written in the specific, quiet way Marcus stood even now, even holding the hand of a child, even in the moment after everything. The balance, the awareness, the eyes that were watching the corridor in both directions, while the rest of him was entirely present for a small alien child who understood what sad but still doing your job looked like. "I will never make that mistake again," Dren said. His aide said, "Hearing the cheapest." Dren looked at the monitor, thinking cheapest and most dangerous were different things. He paused. "Where he comes from, they've never been different things. I should have understood that before now." His aide looked at the monitor too. "What are you going to put in the report?" Dren thought about it. About 3 dead guild assassins in a corridor at 300. About 12 elite operatives and a guild master, and 4 minutes, and a docking bay, and a human who had spent 2 years building a plan inside a plan, and had executed both simultaneously, without the protection plan, compromising the personal plan, or the personal plan compromising the protection plan. Because he was the kind of person who could hold both, because he came from the kind of place that produced people who could hold both. He thought about what Kale had said. A death world. The pressure that produced a species. Millions of years of fighting everything, the environment, the predators, the pathogens, each other, until fighting was not something humans did because it was useful but something humans did because the alternative was extinction, and the species had never chosen extinction. He thought about a quiet man in a corner of a selection room, watching everything, waiting for the thing he was looking for without looking like he was looking. "I'm going to write the report," Dren said, "and the last line is going to be 1 sentence. "What sentence?" Dren looked at the monitor one final time, at Marcus and Lyra, at what Earth produced when it produced someone, and what that someone did when given something worth protecting. "He was from Earth," Dren said. "That's all, just that. Anyone who needs more than that to understand what happened here wasn't paying attention." The report went through the standard diplomatic channels and arrived at 14 desks across 4 species governments within 72 hours, as reports of this nature did. It documented the contract, the breach attempts, the outcome, the casualties on the guild side. It documented the guildmaster's death, and the documentation of 14 operations involving civilian casualties that Marcus had assembled over 2 years, and that the Cooperative's War Crimes Division received as the most comprehensive privately compiled case file they had encountered in a decade. It documented the protection of the senator's daughter, who had been unharmed throughout. The last line of the report was what Dren had said it would be. Within a week, the Kreth Assassin Guild's operational leadership convened an emergency session. The session reviewed the complete operational record of what had happened, the breach team, the 12 assassins, the guildmaster, the human bodyguard who had handled all of it alone, and had apparently been planning to do so for 2 years before the contract was ever offered. The session was, by the account of everyone who attended it, unusually quiet for a meeting of its kind. Operational leadership of an assassin guild was not typically a contemplative profession, but contemplation was what the session produced, because the session was reviewing something that the guild's 300-year operational history did not have a category for. The conclusion the session reached was simple. It was entered into the guild's internal record as a standing advisory for all future contracts and all future operational planning. Do not take contracts where the protection element is human. Do not plan operations against human-protected targets without full intelligence on the specific human involved. And if the intelligence returns a profile that includes Earth military special operations background, do not take the contract, any contract, regardless of value. The advisory did not use many words. The guild was a professional organization, and professional organizations were economical with language. But the advisory had a summary line, which was the line that was read at the beginning of every contract review for the next 20 years, and the line was the line from Dren's report, which had reached the guild through the cooperative's public record, because Dren had requested it be made public record, which was unusual for diplomatic reports, and which he had done anyway because he thought it was important that the record contained certain truths. He was from Earth. That was all it said. Anyone who read the report, the full report, with the breach team and the 12 assassins and the guildmaster and the 2 years of planning and the docking bay, understood what those 4 words meant when they came at the end of it. Anyone who hadn't read the full report and encountered those 4 words on their own understood something too. Not everything, but something. The specific, sufficient something that 4 words contained when the 4 words were the right 4 words in the right order at the end of the right story. He was from Earth, which meant the dark didn't bother him, which meant pain was a variable, not a stop condition, which meant the thing he was protecting mattered more than the thing trying to get past him, every time, without exception, because that was what Earth produced in the people it produced. The specific, absolute, unrevisable priority of the thing that was worth protecting over the thing that threatened it. Which meant you could send 3, you could send 12, you could come yourself. He was from Earth. That was the end of the story. That was also the beginning of the understanding that spread through the guild's advisory, and through Dren's report, and through the 14 government desks, and through the cooperative's war crimes division, processing 2 years of documentation, and through every species that heard what had happened on a diplomatic vessel and a diplomatic station, and in a docking bay where a human had been sitting in the pilot seat waiting. He was from Earth, and the child was safe. And Maya had been 11 years old and had wanted to study xenobotany, and the record contained her name now, in the war crimes documentation, in the section on Velen 7, alongside 339 other names that had not been in any record before Marcus Cole spent 2 years putting them there. That was the job, both jobs, the one everyone knew about and the one no one knew about until it was done, both complete, both real, both worth the 2 years it had taken to arrive at this corridor, this child, this hand holding his in the quiet after everything. He was from Earth. And some things, when you were from Earth, you did not leave undone.